pleasure to introduce you as our fourth and final speaker in this stream today. Andrew is a colleague of mine in the School of Historical and Philosophical Inquiry, and he's chairperson of the UQ Advisory Group and also works in a number of different capacities, including being Deputy Chair of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies Research Ethics Committee. Today, though, Andrew, you're bringing your extensive expertise in relation to philosophy, ethics and genomics to talk about biobanks and ethics. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Liz. So I'll begin like is most appropriate to do, and most people have done it, is to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. I'm here sitting on the Brisbane River, and it's the Turrbal custodian, so I acknowledge those people. And also, in the case I'm doing today, I'm using the case is about a Pinjara man, so I'll say Nuntapalya Pinjara Anuku. So Nuntapalya Anuguru Pinjaraku. So thank them for that as well. So this is my presentation today, and I thought I would quickly just identify some of the definitions of what human data is, what human information is, and the differences. Talk briefly about biobanks, but of course biobanks are intrinsically and instrumentally linked to what I call genomic hybrid infrastructures, and others call it that too. In fact, it came out of the Netherlands in 2013 because that better captures the many dimensions of data and information that is in these infrastructures today, and used and collected, sampled for research and linked and so on. So I'll do that first, and then I want to go to a case of a fellow called Kumanara, and it's a very straightforward genomic case. It's a single mutation. I'm doing that because it's a good access into the world of genomic biobanking, so we'll do that. And then I've got a few slides with 7 recommendations, which I won't talk about a lot. I'll just identify them and people can go back and read them at their leisure. And if there's time for questions, always start by acknowledging that gathering data is incredibly important and should be supported. And there's a couple of quotes there, one from the Productivity Commission and one from Nature, saying that. And so that's the place to begin. This is important to gather this data. I also wanted to begin by, the HRECs are under a lot of pressure, and health services, governance services, to approve quickly. And there's good reasons for approving quickly, and Gordon McGurk did a very interesting presentation on that yesterday, particularly around COVID drugs and so on. But there are some issues, and there are a lot of issues in fact, where the HREC decisions, of course, really matter to people's lived experiences. And I think we should reflect back on what Aristotle, of all people, and others, of course, said, don't deliberate in haste. There are some things that HREC really should take their time and give considered review. And that, of course, is outside of the need for timely, robust review. But I think biobanks and the connection with people's actual lived experiences of having a disease where biobanking is involved as well as clinical care, or as well as biobanking informing clinical care, it's really important to slow down a bit and think carefully about these issues. I'm going to draw on 3 documents today, not so much on the one at the bottom, the 2010 Biobanks paper from NHMRC, which I still think is a great paper. It's a little bit dated now in that it relates to an earlier version of the national statement, and with changes over time, it's not quite there, but within that paper, there's a lot of information. So I encourage people to go and have a look at that. And of course, there's the new AIATSIS Code of Ethics and the guide, which actually gives some very good practical suggestions, a good document to look at. And of course, we have our national statement. And so they're the 3 key documents I'm just going to draw on today very quickly. So human data and information, what is data, what is information? And Jeffrey Pomerantz captures it beautifully. Data is potential information prior to anyone being informed by it. So there is a difference there, and the national statement, as we know, captures this very well, both in element 4 in chapter 3.1, the new chapter which came out in 2018. Data is bits of information in their raw form, whereas information generally refers to data that have been interpreted, analysed and so on. And there's a little bit in the glossary there as well. So there's the collection of data, sometimes information, but data does become other information. It can be linked in different ways. And HRECs need to think about where that data is. And the latest definition from the national statement in element 4 actually does this very well, where it identifies information and data on a continuum. Sometimes data will be non-identifiable to a research assistant along that journey, or a data scientist, but someone generally, particularly in the genomic space, where re-identifiability may be a very useful thing to occur, going back to the person who donated the sample in the first place, there will be probably and hopefully a robust coding process so that can be done. So thinking about where the data is at a particular time, and researchers need to do this, and it was mentioned before by Sarah rightly, a good data management plan will do that so that the research committee knows where the research ethics committee knows where the data is at any particular time. I wanted to mention de-identification because the national statement chooses not to use it or non-identifiable and so on, but people do. And even Sarah in the presentation before talked about de-identified data. So the trick is people will use different words. We still probably need to clarify terminology. However, it's important that whatever word they use, the committee understands what they're talking about. And there's a lot of misunderstandings, I think, around where data whether data is identifiable, non-identifiable, whether it's in a de-identifying process, whether it's anonymous and so on. And often it is all those things at different times, and different people have different access. And this is particularly so with biobanks or genomic hybrid infrastructure. So when you think of biobanks, people think of biospecimens, and that's part of it. 3.2 of the national statement covers the collection, storage of biospecimens very well. I'm not going to dwell on that because I think that's only part of the story because of this idea that I'm arguing that a genomic biobank is a hybrid infrastructure, an organised collection of human biological material combined with associated health information, physical measurements, outcome data in the medical record, health record, and epidemiological information, as well as genomic data derived from the samples. So there's numbers, they're not just stored samples, it's a virtual community of hybrid infrastructure information. And that's why it can be tricky to identify to what people have consented to. HRECs, of course, are really central to this process because they are responsible for the consent process. And I think Don Chalmers, in this little quote here, connected it well with the privacy principles. And that's something we need to think about, as well as noting that biobanks have other governance processes outside of HREC. There are different requirements, recoding, and of course, the NIH and MRC and the Australian research community support increased harmonisation. But what is really important for the HREC to make decisions about is consent. And in 2.214, this is captured really well. And HRECs, many of them are on top of this, and they're actually ensuring that the potential participants actually specifically consent to one of these three things, whether this is only a consent for this project, whether it's extended consent for the use in future projects, or whether it's unspecified. And of course, we're seeing more and more of C and B, unspecified consent, extended consent, and we need to ensure that the potential participants are really well informed. And this is captured by the AIATSIS Code 2, which I won't go into here. And there's a few other interesting documents around the place. This is one that was done by QAMR a couple of years ago, and it talks about community authorization consent is really important. HRECs need to get that right, but in the end, it is authorisation processes, certainly in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander space, which is incredibly important. Wanted to put this article up. Lynn Woodward was actually meant to do this address, but I was unable to do it at the last minute, and I've stepped in. And so I wanted to get this paper up there. It's a very interesting paper, and it steps outside of what many others are arguing, and it encourages the inclusion of Australian Indigenous Australians in biobanks, which I think is a good thing, as long as it's done properly, and that's a good little paper. Okay, so to my case. The reason I wanted to do a case was because I wanted to show the link between the clinical world of people, the life world of people, and what we do at the HREC. Our decisions matter. Now, I'm choosing a monogenic condition here. Most genetic conditions, as people know, aren't monogenetic. A few are. Huntington's is the one I'm going to go for today, just to illustrate how hard that can be. But when we're getting into what we're multifactorial conditions, which are the most common, it becomes really tricky. Interestingly, only a small percentage of diseases are caused by the mutation I'm looking at in my case study. I'm interested in the relationships that people have in their life and with these conditions. So this is a little bit of a story about Huntington disease. I actually pulled this case more than 10 years ago from the New South Wales Health Centre for Genetics, and I've modified it over the years, and I've used it in my teaching for ages. It really gives a nice story about people's experience of ethics committees and clinical conditions. So this is the condition. It's very clear. Death usually results. It's a really bad condition. People know that. Importantly, a child of an affected person has a 50% chance of inheriting the faulty gene that causes the condition. Interestingly, only 15% of people over the world have taken up the option of testing. There may be good reasons for that, and you can think about that. So this is my little case today. It's Kumanara. He's a 25-year-old man whose grandfather died some 10 years ago from the disease. His mother has a 50% chance of developing it. She has the test. She's positive. She would definitely develop it. He now has a 50% chance of developing the disease. He works as an air traffic controller. He loves his job. He feels he could perform his duties for many years. His employer is unaware of the family history, and probably rightly so. And the initial question is, should he have the test? Well, he did have the test. He decides to have the test. He's seen by a GP who consents him to have the test. He's also, because this is HD and because we deal with HD in a very sophisticated manner these days, he sees a clinical geneticist who spends, a good hour with him and talks about probabilities and so on. Easier in this case because it's a single mutation. He gets an additional consent for Kumanara's clinical and other information to be added to an international database approved by a local HREC and a local researcher who's supervising a PhD student on counselling. So some social research is there as well, maybe some qualitative researchers involved in that project. And the nurse genetic counsellor explains all the consents, and he leaves relatively happy, donated his sample. 6 weeks later, he regrets his decision. His friends, and they said he was crazy. You're an air traffic controller, you may lose your job, etc., etc., etc. You can imagine the situation. So he rings the health service where the test was done, and he requests that the test data be destroyed. He doesn't want anything to do with it. He's frightened. He's frightened he's going to lose his job. He feels well and healthy. He sees no reason. The case is further complicated by the fact that the HD result was positive. He doesn't know that. The GP knows that, and also the team know that who've done the test. So everyone knows the result except for the participant of the research projects and the patient in this case. He will certainly develop HD during his life. Now, so when he visited the clinic, just to refresh, he consented to the test, which was a clinical thing. The GP, she actually has the view now that his consent should be honoured and that it should be destroyed. He also consented to being a participant and contributing his data to a local research project. Well, the people involved in that they're not sure what to do, so they're going to seek the local HREC's advice. And he also consented to being a participant and contributing his data to an international research project. So that data and information is already gone. It's already out there, and things have been done with it. So while there are some processes which may make it possible to retrieve some of that's already gone. And to complicate things, the health team all disagree. So what do? They refer the case to the Clinical Ethics Committee. We don't need to worry about that. That's another, though some of you may well be on clinical ethics committees. The Human Research Ethics Committee, which needs to make decisions about the database and the project and what should happen, and also to a specialist HREC, because he's a Pinjarra man originally from Armata. The health team thought that it was a good idea to get their view. Now, their view was actually, as it turned out, was quite a strong view, and that there'd be no engagement with the Pinjarra community or with his community before the testing was done in any of the research projects. It didn't go to an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander specialist committee, this project, so they were very concerned that their Indigenous data had been gathered without an adequate consent process. So there we go. Now, we don't have the time to work through. How much more time do I have, Liz? 5 minutes, maybe? Oh,
sorry, I'm just looking for my unmute button. Yeah, we've got about 5 minutes. That would be great, Andrew.
So we won't work through this, but I just wanted to point out the sorts, we haven't got time to work through answers though, there may be some that come up in questions, and maybe we'll open it up in a few minutes, but it just shows you in a relatively simple condition caused by a single mutation, how life gets in the way. And those decisions that Human Research Ethics Committee are making, as well as the Clinical Ethics Committee, are really important decisions, and they're going to really affect people's lives. So the work we do is fairly important, and we need to not, as I said before, deliberate in haste. And I've got a couple of slides raising some of the questions, which you can look at your leisure. When you look at the recording, I've also posed some additional questions. And Julian Lamont and I a few years ago did a paper where we looked at these sorts of issues in a global sense, and we recommended 7 things that needed to happen. And I think they still do. We don't think there's been a lot of progress, though we had a bit of funding and we did a bit of research in this area. But the lack of, harking back to my original claims, the lack of conceptually consistent universal data terminology is really problematic. And for HRECs, the national statement gives a reasonable guide, but has no terminology. And researchers use words like de-identification. Humans need to. So we need to do a bit more work there. The particularities of consent vary across cultures and so on, still a problem. The different perspectives about the nature and role of data information pathways. National statement's done a really good job of identifying what one could do with these incidental findings and so on. They still are tricky to resolve though, and it still needs to be thought about those, and each individual HREC needs to think about that. This is the Indigenous lens. People's different experience of place really matters. And for example, what many Indigenous people want can be quite different from what other groups of people want and so on. And we need to think about the great diversity and how we plug into between genetics, genomics, data science and decision making within governance frameworks is really interesting. This is some stuff we're working on at the moment, particularly the role of the data scientists. In Australia, data scientists don't actually have a code of ethics, and we're working on that at the moment. There are some international codes, and all courses in data science, which are usually taught at master's level, are now including ethics and law, which is a really good thing. But it's the only exposure these people get to the sorts of things that we do on a daily basis within their whole many years of study. And it can be challenging for them to start thinking about things like, what is the nature of consent and why does it matter? What is the nature of conflict of interest? Is there a conflict of interest? I'm working for an employer who owns this data. But of course, the data would have been from a person initially, and so on. 6, recognising and managing conflicts of interest. Well, I've just talked about that. And finally, determining how to engage broad community engagement and secure Biobanks' social licence to operate. And that's kind of the nub of it, really. And we're still working on it. I just thought at the end I'd put this beautiful little diagram. It's a Maori diagram. Taonga in the middle means precious item, tissue, data, DNA. Tinganga is protocols and practices. So you can see how it goes out to protocols and practices. And then there's principles. It's just a nice little diagram, and within each of those elements, there's a big discussion. That's a really nice little paper. I encourage people to read it. And that's it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. A really fascinating discussion. We do have one question for you, and that is one that we do come across at HRECs, and it's around the question of, are you suggesting that researchers should consult with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities if there is a chance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, not AIATSIS people, being recruited? So it's that whole kind of question of number of people likely in an ordinary population who would identify as being Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander, and what's our responsibility in relation with that? What would your advice?
This can be a challenging issue for many non-Indigenous people, and there is a grey area. And I think even when we rolled out the first edition of the Values and Ethics Statement many years ago, Colin Thompson answered the question when people said, why is there even a statement? And the answer was because it needed to be there. But the challenge was, in a lot of research, Indigenous, Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islanders are captured in the research. And the question is, do you need to be consulting with those people as opposed to when you are targeting Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander people? So if you're doing research and you're targeting Indigenous people, you certainly should be sitting down with those people and finding out what questions they want answered and not imposing it. And for too long that has been imposed. So hence we have the various guidelines and the codes and so on, and the specialist Indigenous group, which is primarily Indigenous, mostly Indigenous people, to review that sort of stuff. It's when the researchers may be doing some research, and I'll give you an example. There was, and it had a really good outcome. It was a peripheral vascular biobank, which was operating in the north of Australia, and the Indigenous people, there'd been no specific conversation with Indigenous people, but it happened. There were a lot of local Aboriginal people captured within that biobank. And a couple of local Indigenous people raised it with the ethics committee, and there was a conversation with the researcher. The researcher actually appreciated that conversation. A steering committee was set up. Good advice was given by the Indigenous folk up there, the Aboriginal people, and they're now, that project, they're doing comparisons of Indigenous, non-Indigenous data and so on, and things worked out really well. The secret is sitting down with the people you want to research about or with, and having a true process of engagement. And if you look at the guide that goes with the latest AIATSIS code, that's clearly articulated. And interestingly, it's human rights based, though Australia hasn't recognised that international human rights code guidelines, but it still is human rights based. And I think you can find a lot of insight there. But there is the grey area where you're not sure. But if you're not sure, why not have a conversation with Indigenous people? You can learn a lot. And, you know, like look at that Maori diagram there. That's really got a lot of the answers for this stuff. And Indigenous people are very good at understanding these complex things and the things in the nature of place. So I encourage everyone to talk to Australia's Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders. I hope that's answered it. It was a long answer, wasn't it? I'm so sorry. I get a bit excited.
It was a complicated question and a really important one to take some time.
I think so, yeah.
So we are pretty much at time, and